the ironic thing about Bitcoin being money is that it gets us to stop thinking about money. If life starts to get easier over time because we have more capacity as our purchasing power is going up, we start fixating less on money and more on how we're going to show up and what is important to us and what it is that we value. And so I think monetary expression is so important. And Bitcoin, on the flip side of that, realigns all of those things. And so all of a sudden, if we can direct capital to where we see fit, well, guess what? Areas of the economy that actually are offering value start to thrive. We live in a world where the government continually step in and they put barriers for people to express themselves. We're always just trying to be able to seek truth. And I don't see it as in like a negative thing or a fearful thing that it's just like, oh my God, the world is so broken. I look at it more from the perspective that if we're trying to seek truth, that's the only way at which we can alter our trajectory towards actually creating a society of prosperity. Day to day, you have these conversations with individuals and they'll throw out a comment and you're like, that's interesting. How did you come to that? And you'll find they're 30 steps up the ladder, but they can't explain the 30 steps that got them up the ladder.
Hi, Seb. How are you doing? Everything fine on your end?
Oh man, it's great to be back, Robin. I think we recorded, I don't know, maybe like 18 months ago. And I really, really enjoyed our conversation. And I mentioned beforehand that I just think you have such a way with words and the way that you interview, it brings people in. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh man, thank you so much. That's really kind of you. Maybe as a fun first question, because I got that question today and I never asked it anyone. So I'm trying it with you. What do you think most Bitcoiners don't realize about Bitcoin that you actually believe in?
So I would say, oh man, I love this question. This is such a good question. I would say there's kind of like two components. The first is the ironic thing about Bitcoin being digital money is that it gets us to stop thinking about money. The world we live in today, because money is broken down and it makes it almost impossible for us to save and to be able to kind of thrive, we become so fixated on money because we're simply just trying to put food on the table, put a roof over our heads, that we're constantly focusing on money. Now, what's interesting about Bitcoin is the opposite is true. If life starts to get easier over time because we have more capacity as our purchasing power is going up, we start fixating less on money and more on how we're going to show up and what is important to us and what it is that we value. And so the ironic thing about Bitcoin being money is that it gets us to stop thinking about money. And the second part to that is that I believe personally that Bitcoin, its most pure essence is that it's a spiritual tool. I think it's a spiritual tool in that the world today, we're so disconnected because we're so stuck on survival. We're so stuck on just trying to exist because life is hard that we're not thinking about our intuition. We're not listening to what our body is telling us. We're not listening to the world around us and all the kind of the signs and the symptoms that are taking place. We're just simply existing because when we're fearful, our aperture of awareness narrows. And so I think Bitcoin is a spiritual tool in that, again, as we have more capacity, we have more time to look inwards. As we have more time to look inwards, we have more ability to listen to that small little subtle intuition guiding us in certain directions. Or if the world is trying to lead us in a certain trajectory, we're able to listen to those cues. And so I think Bitcoin is a spiritual tool in that it supports us growing as a community, building culture, supporting us. I think it's profound just because it gives us more capacity.
I heard that before, that Bitcoin is spiritual money. I forgot from whom I heard it, but there was someone that said Bitcoin is spiritual money. I love that description.
There's a early on in my Bitcoin journey. I haven't been in Bitcoin that super long. I'm not one of the OGs, but I would say I was very curious about Bitcoin in kind of like 2018, 2019, and ended up going full head over heels, like down the rabbit hole in 2020. And in around 2020, 2021, I stumbled across a guy named Seyr Catharo. And he doesn't have that many followers. I don't understand how. And he's a Bitcoiner, and he has a podcast called Bitcoin Consciousness that I don't know if he even posts on anymore, but it was all about Bitcoin and spirituality. And he is one of the most profound individuals. And so if you're interested in the spiritual space, I think that as a community, what I think is so interesting is we have people from all different backgrounds, whether it's like economics, whether it's just like single mums that are interested in Bitcoin, whether it is people that are interested in just kind of finance in general, whether it is a builder, you name it. But I think that what we're starting to see is a growing spiritual component, because people that are more focused in that area are recognizing that we have a lack of groundedness in society. And Bitcoin gives us that capacity to look inwards more and become more grounded, which I think is profound.
This is actually a question so for me right now, I'm very much of the belief that we are right now very early and Bitcoin will become the global reserve asset. And I'm just curious on two things, how we get there and what that will do to society. Those are the two questions that I'm basically wondering about. The other questions are kind of solved for me in my head. So those are the very open question for me still. Do we come peacefully in? Is it like a steady and slow, or is it like there's some Samson Mao Omega candle in there? How do we get there? And also like, what implication does it have if, I think you wrote the book, Hidden Cost of Money, if there's no more inflation? And the spiritual aspect is really interesting in that question. How will Bitcoin actually impact our daily lives? Like I'm wondering about that so much.
So, you know what? I'll start with the second one, the second question first, and then I'll go back to the first one. And I think that in my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, one of the ways that I look at money is slightly different to kind of just as your standard as medium of exchange that most people look at money. I look at it also as a medium of expression like language. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value. Just like we use voice to express to the world our thoughts, what it is that we value internally, money is used to express to the world what we value monetarily. And so you can, if you walk into, I don't know, a grocery store and you see someone buying grass-fed beef and organic vegetables, and then another person buying cigarettes and microwave meals, you can see what it is that they value by how they direct their capital. Now, the problem that we face in society today is that because we're facing inflation, our purchasing power is declining, it's impacting our ability to direct capital towards what we value. If by the time I have worked and I've earned some money and then I've saved that money and then I go to spend it, but my purchasing power is diminished 30%, then I have 30% less capacity to show up authentically and direct my capital where I see fit. And then on top of that, it's not just inflation. We see things like capital controls. If you live in China and what you value is supporting your family, and all of a sudden the Chinese government is like, well, you're not allowed to invest in international assets, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to withdraw your funds outside of China. Well, all of a sudden it becomes very hard for you to direct capital towards what you value, which is protecting your family. You may want to protect your purchasing power so you can support your kids in the future, but your purchasing power is being diminished in the local currency. And then finally, you also just have regulations, which are propping up industries and altering how cash flows in society. So it may say you can spend money here, but you can't spend money there. And so what that's doing is it's impeding our ability to express ourselves monetarily. It's impeding our ability to direct capital to what it is that we value as individuals. Now, if I take a step back and look at kind of an analogous situation, well, if as a child, our parents didn't allow us to express certain emotions, like let's say our mum was like, we don't want you to be sad. So anytime you start crying, they're just like, give you a candy bar or try to stop you from crying. Or anytime you're angry, they're just like, we don't want you to be like, you're not allowed to be angry in this house. So they stop you from being angry and they put you in the corner. Well, what is depression? Depression is the depressing of emotions. It is when we're not allowed to express ourselves fully. So as an adult, we don't know how to express those emotions. And so it leads to all of these symptoms, these anxiety, depression, drug use, suicide. And so I would say that the issues we face in society today, whether it is huge environmental destruction because of our consumption habits, whether it is a breakdown in the parent-child bond because parents are having to work more because their money is worth less, whether it is a breakdown in politics because governments can fund themselves endlessly without support from the populace, whether it is a breakdown in business practices because they're incentivized to take risks because they continually are bailed out. I would say all of these are symptoms of people not being able to express themselves monetarily and directing money to where they see fit. And so I think monetary expression is so important. And Bitcoin, on the flip side of that, realigns all of those things. And so all of a sudden, if we can direct capital to where we see fit, well, guess what? Areas of the economy that actually are offering value start to thrive. And not only that, but if you're living in a nation and you do not agree with what the nation is doing, you do not agree with what the direction the government is going, well, if enough people decide, you know what, I'm going to direct my capital where I see fit. Maybe I'm going to leave the country. Maybe I'm just going to store my money in Bitcoin. it becomes very hard for that government to thrive if you're operating on a Bitcoin standard. And so I very much believe that Bitcoin flips all the incentives on its head. At the moment, our incentives towards kind of like fiscal irresponsibility, there's breakdown in connection, life is getting harder. The incentives flip to the other side, which all of a sudden we have more capacity as our purchasing power is increasing. That gives immense benefits to, say, parents. Parents have more capacity to spend time with their kids, support their kids more. It also has immense benefits for businesses. Businesses has to be fiscally responsible. If they're not, if they borrow beyond their means, then they're going to slowly wither away. So it incentivizes value creation. It allows individuals to direct capital to areas of the economy that are actually offering value, as opposed to those that are just being propped up by intervention. And so I think that, to me, it really realigns all of the incentives in society. And that is, I just find profound. To answer kind of your first question, which is, what does it look like actually getting there? That's hard. It's it's so challenging, because I think that the reality is that we've borrowed beyond our means for so long that in order to be able to transition to a new system, we have to live within our means. We have so much debt that if the system was to implode in on itself right now, there would be so much pain. There'll be so much carnage. And so Jeff Booth always talks about kind of building a parallel system. And what we're trying to do is just increase the size of that bridge over to that parallel system. And in time, people will realize, those people that are living over there in the parallel system, life seems to be getting easier for them. They seem to be thriving. And at a certain point, the pain of existing in the current system becomes greater than the energy expenditure and the pain of transitioning to a new system. And so what I'm hoping is that we're building out the rails right now. We're building out the custodial, self-custodial features to make it more and more user-friendly. We're building out kind of whether it's the companies to be able to onboard these individuals, so that by the time we start to see more of a mass adoption of it, we have the capacity to do so. Because I don't know if we have the capacity to do so right now. And I don't think the user experience, especially when it comes to, say, self-custody, is there yet for the average individual.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always this question, what if 100% of the world all of a sudden wants to go on Bitcoin tomorrow? I think we're not ready for that. I think the rails are not there yet. The custodians are not there yet. The services are not there yet. The infrastructure, it's just not working out right now. Also with what that means for the main layer, and we have to go on the second layer because there's not enough space. So it's good if it's gradual.
Mm-hmm.
we want the Titanic to sink slow, and the lifeboat to slowly increase in size with Bitcoin. But one thing that was really interesting what you said is monetary expression. I think we don't think of money as language. We don't think about money being something that is expressive. But it is expressive. It is a language. We use it as gifts, like in Austria. I don't know if it's in America also like that. But if you are like a kid and you have birthday, like you're getting, I don't know, 10 years old, 12 years old, it's custom that the aunts and the uncles give you like 10 euros and 5 euros for your birthday to get you started in life and stuff like that. So there's so many traditions and functions in society where we use Bitcoin not only as, hey, you give me that good and I give you that as money as exchange, but we actually use Bitcoin like money directly as a language of gifting someone something. There are many different things like that. So fiat is kind of manipulating our language. It's kind of putting a noise into the signal of language. I never looked at it as a language.
Well, it's interesting because I find one thing that I've decided, I live in Canada, and we're about to, I think it's like April 27th, we're about to have our election as to who is going to be the prime minister of the country. Now, the reality on my end is that I don't believe in the system. So, cool, I can vote left or I can vote right. But the reality is, although there's someone maybe I would lean a little more right, I would say that I don't want to direct my energy towards the system. And when we vote, we are expressing what it is that we value, who it is that we value, who aligns most with our values. We're expressing ourselves. And what people often forget is that, well, when we vote, we're actually voting twice. We're voting once for the individual, and secondly, we're voting for the system. We're directing our energy and we're saying we actually support the system. We support the continuation of the process which has led us to where we are today. And so I think what a lot of people forget about is we have a third way of voting. That third way of voting, that third way of expressing ourselves is money. When we direct our capital to what we value, we are saying we're choosing this over this. This is what we value. It's the same. It's just another form of voting. It's another form of expression. And I think people often forget about that. And like, to your point, like when it comes to money breaking down, it's impacting our ability to express what we value. Now, can you imagine if there was regulations in place that basically said on the voting ballot, hey, there's these 5 people, but there's actually regulations, so you can't actually vote for the top 3 people. You can only vote for the bottom 2 people. So just forget about the top 3 people. And that's our monetary system today. It's like, hey, there's industries that we don't believe in. We're going to put regulations that make it incredibly hard for you to be able to go and direct your capital towards those things. For instance, I believe in health and I believe in raw dairy. Well, in Canada, raw dairy is illegal. You cannot go buy raw dairy. So I cannot go and purchase raw dairy to go and support myself, my family, those that I care about, because there's regulation impeding me from doing so. And so this is where I think it's so interesting, is that we live in a world where the government continually step in and they put barriers for people to express themselves, whether that's through money, whether that's through language, through free speech being suppressed, you name it. There's a lot of suppression that we find in society.
Wait, raw dairy, is it like milk directly from the farmer?
Yeah.
That's illegal?
Yeah. So this is the thing. It's crazy that the only way that you can buy dairy is pasteurized dairy that is through kind of the grocery store. There is a workaround. Like I have what's called a cow share in Canada. And so a cow share is if you own cows, you're allowed to drink the milk from your own cow. And so because of that, people end up doing a cow share where they buy a portion of a cow or a fraction. They own a fraction of a cow, a share of a cow. And then you're not paying for the milk. You're paying to service your cow, and then you're getting milk from your cow. And so I get around the raw dairy in that regard. But again, what's interesting is this kind of goes back to, I believe this ties back to kind of the incentives of the system. And you start to see kind of a breakdown when we start to see huge government oversight, increased regulation, it leads to all of these byproducts. And so how did, for instance, I find this interesting because it ties back to kind of money again, but like how did raw dairy become illegal? Well, during the Great Depression, because all of the farmers were struggling financially, they didn't have the resources to be able to actually feed their cows proper nutritious food. And so what did they start doing? They went along to the distilleries and they started to feed the cows the output from the distilleries, the slop, and the cows started to get super sick. But they were still using that milk and selling it. And then so people started to get unbelievably sick from the milk they were drinking from the cows until they realized, I wonder what happens if you heat milk up. And so they started to heat milk up, the pasteurization process, which kills the bacteria. But it not only kills the bad bacteria, but it also kills the good bacteria. So you've now completely destroyed a lot of the nutritional value of milk. And the government comes in and says, you know what? This is good. We're killing all of the bacteria. We're going to actually put regulation in place and say you're not allowed to sell raw milk anymore because it's making people sick. But it's not that it was raw milk that was making people sick. It's that we had a broken financial system that impeded the ability of farmers to be able to support themselves financially, which led to the degradation of the quality of food. And I just find this stuff like so fascinating. Like, again, intervention, monetary intervention, it ends up leading to all of these unintended consequences. And one more quick story I'll share that really kind of stood out to me, and I believe I mentioned it in the book, The Hidden Cost of Money, which was during around kind of like the 30s and 40s in the US, the government decided to go and subsidize grain production. And so it started pumping millions of dollars into producing different types of grains and corn. And so all of a sudden, farmers that were farming, they had an incentive. They would make more money if they were to farm certain types of grain as opposed to vegetables or meat, animals, you name it. And so all of a sudden you had this shift, this artificial shift of farmers move over to grain production. Then as a result of the grain production, we saw a boom in all of the big grain companies. What did this create? Well, we saw Kellogg's, we saw Quakers, a lot of these huge multinational corporations start to explode because they started making a ton of money and grain was super cheap. As a result, we saw things like high fructose corn syrup start to enter the market. Well, guess what we've got now? We've got a massive, huge rate of diabetes as a result of all of these processed grain products because there's unbelievable amounts of excess grain. But not only that, Quakers and Quakers, Kellogg's, and a lot of these other big grain producers, because they were making so much money from all of the grain subsidies and the excess grain, they started to use that excess money to lobby the government. They lobbied the FDA and created the food pyramid. And the food pyramid inverted what we thought was healthy. We've traditionally eaten a more animal-based diet with fruits and vegetables on top of that. And then above that, at the top of the pyramid, we have a little bit of grains. Well, we flipped that on its head, and all these grain producers, given that they have an incentive to push grain, said the base of our diet should be grain, and at the very tip top should be animal products. We should minimize the amount of animal products we eat. And what has happened over the last kind of 50 to 80 years, we have seen diabetes skyrocket. We have seen obesity skyrocket. We have seen heart disease skyrocket. We have seen all of this stuff skyrocket as a result of monetary intervention. We intervened monetarily and we altered the course, the incentives towards what people naturally want. And I just find that profound.
I want to share this with you because I laughed really out loud when you said like we're not able to buy raw milk. It gives me a little bit of hope for Austria because we have something. It's called Abhofverkauf. It means basically buy it directly from the farmer, and there are many farmers. In my hometown. There are like 5,000 people, I think they are living there, where I originally come from. And there are probably like 20 farmers where you can directly go there and you can buy it. And how it works is either they open like on a Saturday morning and you can actually buy it like in a supermarket kind of a style. But way more common are those things. Wait, here it was. Yeah, it's basically just like a small wooden house and you can go in there and there's like fridges and you just take it out. You see on the price list how much it is and you just throw the money in. So like really trust based. You can just rob all the milk out and all the foods and directly from the farm and go. But it works in Austria for some reason. And that's why it was so foreign for me that you cannot buy raw milk because I only got raw milk when when I lived up on a farm. I got raw milk every day directly from the cow. I sometimes milked it myself. I mean, we did not milk it like that. We had like those machines for the cow, but I saw the cow. I petted the cow that I got the milk from directly. So that's why the concept is just so completely out of the norm for me. Never heard that.
No, it's wild. Just how different cultures show up. And what's interesting is like I get raw milk now. I've had raw milk for probably about 2.5 years. And when I have friends come over, I'm just like, oh, hey, do you want like milk in your coffee? I have raw milk. And they're just like, oh no, I don't want to touch that stuff. I would never drink that. And so you start to realize that when you start intervening monetarily, you create all of these regulations that lead to, say, basically the illegality of raw milk or the destruction of red meat in society where you think red meat is bad or saturated fats are bad. The average individual has no idea. They're completely brainwashed. And so I think it's fascinating because for me, what Bitcoin has done is Bitcoin, in a sense, and I notice this with other individuals as well, is Bitcoin leads you down this rabbit hole where you start questioning the money. And then when you start realizing, maybe if the monetary system isn't what it seems, what other systems aren't what they seem? And then you start digging into the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the educational industry. And you're just like, oh my God, like we're living in this world that is a bit of a facade. And it is almost like, I think there's a reason why Bitcoiners resonate with this whole idea of the matrix. Do you want to take the red pill or the blue pill? Do you want to know you're in the simulation? Or would you rather step outside or would you rather just be sucked in and just absorbed into the simulation, have no idea? And I think a lot of Bitcoin is what I really admire is we're truth seeking. We're always just trying to be able to seek truth. And I don't see it as in like a negative thing or a fearful thing that it's just like, oh my God, the world is so broken. I look at it more from the perspective that if we're trying to seek truth, that's the only way at which we can alter our trajectory towards actually creating a society of prosperity, actually creating connection and community and actually moving towards a society where we're healthy and we're thriving. Because if we're not seeking truth, then we're going to be continually blinded by propaganda or this intervention.
It's that mind virus. The government is trying to do something, and it actually alters the way we think. And it's so, and I catch myself also doing that. We hold opinions that we heard multiple times, but we never really researched. And because we heard it multiple times, we never questioned it. And that's why we hold that opinion, but we never actually questioned this thing. And I see it so many times. So when someone says something that I highly disagree with, I just ask them many why questions. And usually after the third why question, they don't really have more substance because they never really thought about why this is like that. They just adopted that thinking. So that's what I call it mind virus. It's the matrix is like staying in the system. It's more convenient, just like going with the flow. I get that. But stepping outside is just makes a lot of fun if you're outside of that, and then you're all of a sudden questioning things. So I think Bitcoiner, because there's such a big thing breaking with money, they naturally question other things. But I catch myself also sometimes holding opinions that I just heard a lot but never question. Like it still happens.
I think this idea of the mind virus, I find it really interesting. I was actually starting to throw together a bit of a presentation or like a slide deck for some talk in the future. I hadn't actually planned it. And it was this idea that there is this virus in cat feces called Toxoplasma gondii. And what's really interesting is when mice come near the feces, they end up getting they take in or absorb this Toxoplasma gondii, and this virus alters their brain towards being attracted towards cats. And so you'll see mice that will come out and walk straight in front of a cat. So the cat can basically go and eat it. And this mind virus has basically completely altered its ability to think for itself and to be able to assess risk. And what's interesting is I think our current monetary system, the fiat system, has done the exact same thing. It has put us into this state where all of a sudden we become so reliant on government that we're no longer thinking for ourselves. We're no longer being able to assess a situation and to be able to think from first principles and break things down. And so to your point, I find it really interesting because day to day, you have these conversations with individuals and they'll throw out a comment and you're like, that's interesting. How did you come to that? And you'll find they're 30 steps up the ladder, but they can't explain the 30 steps that got them up the ladder. And you're just like, this is the world we live in today.
They're up the ladder, but they don't know how they got actually there. It's like you drank too much, you partied too much, and you actually don't know how you got home the other day. Which raises an interesting question. When we are on a complete Bitcoin standard, or we're moving more and more towards that, how much central intervention should there be, or what kind of, or is it just a free market that lives on its own, or how do you look at how we organize ourselves on a Bitcoin standard?
For sure. So, there's a book that I read during the pandemic that really stood out to me, and it's a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And one of the things it talks about is what is the environment which enables like authoritarian, totalitarian environments to actually thrive. And this guy looks all the way back throughout history. He goes through like Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il. You'll look through Mao. You'll look through Stalin. You'll look through all of these various individuals that are led to these very controlling structures. And there's a theme. There are 4 stages that take place. The first stage is in society, there is meaninglessness. And that is that people are struggling, whether it's financially, they're struggling to feed their families, they're struggling to show up. And so there's no meaning in life. They don't feel like they're able to actually like chart a course and try and reach some form of goal. They're simply existing. So life doesn't have meaning. The second stage is loneliness. Because they're having to work so much, whether it's because they're in communism, whether it's because of the environment, they're basically just trying to exist and survive. They're not able to spend time in community. They're not able to connect to the same extent, which leads to a whole heap of loneliness. The third stage is what's called free-floating anxiety. Because life is so tough, because they don't find meaning, because they're lonely, all of a sudden they start to have this free-floating anxiety. But there's a difference between fixed anxiety, which is if I'm standing on top of a giant cliff face, there's a reason why I'm anxious. I have something to fix my anxiety to. free floating anxiety is I don't know, like I just feel anxious all the time. I don't know why I'm feeling anxious. And it's incredibly disorientating and debilitating because it's kind of like a full sense of anxiety, but you can't really attach it to anything. And then the fourth stage is because there is meaninglessness, loneliness, anxiety, there tends to be a lot of frustration and anger. Now, when these four conditions are met, if you have a leader come out and say, hey, the reason why you're feeling anxious and the reason why you're feeling a sense of loneliness and the reason why you're struggling is because of this entity or this group. We've seen this time and time and time again in North Korea, and we've seen it as capitalism is the enemy. Stalin, again, capitalism. With, you could say, Hitler, the Jewish population. Like they've always had this enemy at which they have directed their energy towards. And as a result, you find society can quickly fall into what's called mass formation, where people give up their values, give up their beliefs because they believe that, this individual is going to be able to fix me. I'm going to be able to slowly move through these challenges that I've been facing. And so we give up our moral values, our integrity, and people are willing to do wild things when they're in mass formation. We saw it during the pandemic, where people were basically isolating certain groups of the population because of certain beliefs they held. They weren't allowing them to go certain places. Like, it's wild to see mass formation take place. Now, in my book, I add there's one more condition for this to take place. That condition is condition 0, which is a broken monetary system. For all of this to take place, you have to have at least had a broken monetary system first, because otherwise, if people actually have the ability to save, well, people have the ability to direct their capital towards what they see fit, to be able to think about the future, to be able to build a family. So that meaninglessness doesn't step in. On top of that, if people have capacity to save, well, all of a sudden, you have more capacity as your purchasing power increases to spend time in community. So that loneliness never kind of kicks in. And so I think that our current system, when we have a broken monetary system, it leads to a lot of these authoritarian, totalitarian environments. And so it impacts people's ability, because people are so focused on simply survival, it impacts people's ability to think for themselves. And so I think that we may have some form of centralization in the future. I don't know what that future looks like. And this is kind of to answer your question. I don't know what that future looks like, whether we go into what some Bitcoiners believe is like anarchy, where there's no government, it's just purely free market, or whether we do still continue along a democratic process. But what I do believe is that with Bitcoin, if you have more capacity, then all of a sudden you have more ability to think for yourself and think about the information at which we're consuming. And so if we have more ability to think for ourselves and think about the information we're consuming, we can then look at those leaders in power and break down, they're saying they want to do this, this, and this. Does that actually make sense? If I look at their historical track record, are they actually going to show up in that way? Historically, if they'd done this, this, and this, would it have panned out? And so I think we have a society that it's not that we may completely break down centralization, but is that by separating money from state and living on a Bitcoin standard, we have greater capacity to analyze the information we're consuming, so that even if there is centralization, it doesn't lead to authoritarianism. It doesn't lead to these kind of like oppressive dictatorships and such. And that, I think, is profound.
I had an interesting thought when you explained the conditions of what has to be met, and then there's the leader coming in, and we have one entity that we all rally behind, like we put our anger behind that one enemy. I thought about, like Bitcoin, I do the same thing with central banks, but like the other conditions, it just like, it hit me like, but I guess any movement, no matter if it's a good or bad movement, has to have some kind of enemy picture. Like there's something.
Absolutely. And I think there's a difference between when we look at central banking, we can, if we break it down and look historically and look from where we've come from to where we are now, we can start to see cause and effect. The result of broken money leading to this, this, and this, and this, and leading to these symptoms throughout society. Whereas I think the difference in totalitarianism is you can create this fictional narrative that says this group or this individual is leading to all of your issues. And because people are so in their head, they're so struggling, they're just trying to exist, they don't have the capacity to actually determine, well, is that group actually causing these issues? All they want is I just want to be free from this pain. I just want to be free from what I'm going through. And so during COVID, we obviously, and I don't want to get this this podcast that's silenced on YouTube, but during COVID, there was a certain group of individuals that didn't take some form of medical trajectory. And what we saw in the news is that group was vilified basically as if they were the ones that are causing everything. When you step back and you look at it, that's not true in the slightest. Like now all the data has come out which says there's like that group, if anything, were the ones that were able to fight COVID. Their immune systems were able to stay strong. And now the people that took the original trajectory are having a whole bunch of health issues. And so what you start to realize is that a lot of totalitarianism, authoritarianism is built on fear. It's not built on truth. And on top of that, once that enemy, like we see this with, say, Stalin. With Stalin, he ended up directing his energy towards the farmers. Well, by destroying the farmers, they had no food. So now they need to direct their energy towards something else. And so you keep rotating from enemy to enemy to enemy to enemy until eventually a totalitarian, authoritarian environment eats itself. It completely destroys itself. They cannot last indefinitely into the future because they need to constantly be fixated on some form of enemy, which is the reason why the populace is feeling all of these things that which they're feeling. And so that's why they're just not sustainable. They can't exist into the long term. They always break down.
Let's take a break for a moment and appreciate the beauty that Coin Vigilante has made with the Bitcoin watches. Those watches are the most amazing, the most elegant way of showing that you are a true Bitcoiner. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece. Make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. And now if you have Bitcoin, I really do hope that you don't have it on exchange. But if you do have it on exchange, I have two ways for you to deal with that. The first way is you put it on a hardware wallet. That's the entry for you to get into the self-custody game. I recommend BitBox, Bitcoin only edition for that. It's a super simple and secure way. And if you check out the link in the description, you even get 5% off if you use the code Robin. And the second way is the Bitcoin Way. The Bitcoin Way is your all-in partner in terms of how to get the most out of your sovereignty. They will personalize for you a self-custody setup that is perfect for your individual situation. They will show you how you can secure your own devices. Securing your Bitcoin is not enough. You also have to keep all your devices secure. One topic that is overlooked often is the inheritance plan. What happens with your Bitcoin once you are no longer here? Do you have a plan for that in place already? And last but not least, if you're in jurisdictions where you don't feel safe, it's better to get a plan B. For all that, head over to thebitcoinway.com/Robin to get a 30-minute free call. And just a quick side note, I will be for the first time ever speaking at the Bitcoin Prague event in June. It will be absolutely legendary and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you there. You can get your ticket in the link down in the description of Bitcoin Prague, and very important, use code Robin to get 10% off your ticket. I'm really looking forward seeing you there. This is a really good point. Yeah, I love that. One question that it raises me a lot, and I flip-flopped on that like already 2 times. I was into politics a lot before Bitcoin. I was on a liberal party, and I was really rallying behind them. Now I'm actually completely out of the party, and when I started being in Bitcoin, I started to being completely away from politics. So much so that people were talking about current events and I did not know anything. There was some big thing happening in politics or news or in the world, and I didn't know it about. So for example, right now it would be tariffs. Like there's tariffs from Trump coming, like everyone talks about it. It's like in the news cycle every day basically. And back in the day, I wouldn't have known about it. Now I'm getting more into it again, where I'm trying to keep up with what's going on within my jurisdiction, just to see where is the direction going. Is it going in this direction or that direction? And I'm voting, which I also debated a lot. Should I vote? Should I not vote? Do I make the system stronger or not? And I'm curious to get your take on that, because first I thought I make the system stronger when I vote, but then I also thought I rather have the least bad guy in there than let my vote go for waste and have the other ones take over. That is kind of my thought now of like, okay, if I'm not voting him because I would have voted him, I make him automatically stronger with that. It's a weird thing, but how do you look at voting and how much Bitcoiners should actually get into with politics?
Oh man, I've had this conversation a few times over the last week just with friends, and it's such a challenging question because I think that as Bitcoiners, we think a lot about time preference. For those that aren't conscious of what time preference is, like it's a spectrum. On one end, you've got high time preference, being impulsive, meeting my immediate needs right now. And then on the other side, you've got low time preference, thinking about the future, thinking about prosperity and security. And I think that when I think about voting, given that I don't agree with the system, as I mentioned previously, and I think the system itself is broken, and when we vote twice. We're voting once for the person, the party that we want in, and two, for the system. We're directing our energy towards the system. We're saying that I want the system to continue. And so there's a part of me that feels like, and this is my opinion, that it's high time preference thinking to vote if you don't believe in the system, because it's just like, hey, yes, this party may be slightly better than that party, but in the grand scheme of things, I just don't agree with the system in general. And I think that the more individuals actually just step back energetically, take their spiritual energy out of the system and maybe direct it towards what it is they value. And in my case, in our case, I assume that thing is Bitcoin. Well, then what we're doing is we're directing our energy towards this thing that can actually make change. And the government, if it exists on fiat currency, it can keep on printing money. But at a certain point, if more and more people are drawing their energy out of the existing system and directing it towards Bitcoin, Bitcoin's purchasing power is increasing. Or fiat currency, they're having to continually intervene because they can't meet their fiscal responsibilities. Well, at a certain point, the current system breaks down and the system has to recreate itself into a new functioning system. But under this system, I would argue that the money would be separate from state, which then realigns all the incentives again. And so I think long term, I believe that it's about thinking about where we want to direct our energy and what makes the most sense, as opposed to existing in this current system being like, oh, I believe in Bitcoin over here, but I'm existing in this current system, which is not serving us. And I know Jeff Booth talks about it when he is on podcasts. And he says, for a long time, I was very pro Bitcoin, but I spent 99% of my time in my fiat businesses. And it's just like, what am I doing? If I want this thing to actually change, I got to direct my time and energy towards the area of my life which I want to change, which is Bitcoin. And then he left all his fiat businesses, put managers in place for those to kind of take care of the business so he can direct his energy towards Bitcoin. And of course, I don't want to sway anyone. This is my personal belief. I think that everyone needs to make that decision for themselves. And I totally understand that there's a rational argument to say, hey, this party is way better than that party in the short term, so I'm going to vote them just because I don't want my vote to go to waste. I understand that argument. I just wonder if it is a high time preference thinking as opposed to that low time preference. How do we actually transition in the long term to a better system?
That's super interesting. When you talk about the system, do you mean democracy directly, or do you mean more broadly the money printer and then the power structures around that on like a more broad scale?
It's a really good question, because I think there's two aspects. First, I think that our system, if we were to simply remove the monetary system from the state and our current like democratic process that exists in most nations, I think that alone would realign a lot of the incentives of the system. Because I think, again, if a government can fund itself without support from the populace by simply hitting print on the printer, well, then they have no obligation to actually create value. If you own a small little business and in the back office you have a money printer, do you actually have to create products that create value? No, you don't. And so I think that what separating money from state does is it holds the government accountable to listening to the populace. So that's kind of the first step. But secondly, I am increasingly of the belief that the democratic process is flawed. And as for what we actually need, I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to claim that I'm kind of an expert in this area or I have an answer to this. But I think the democratic process doesn't support accountability, given that you can have a party that come into power, they can make all of these changes, completely destroy the nation, make them hugely indebted, lead to all of this social unrest, and then they can just be like, oh, well, I'm just going to resign. And there's no repercussions. And on top of that, I find what's really interesting is that politicians, to become a politician, you need a certain skill. That skill is the skill of persuasion and the skill of communication. You need to be able to express your ideas and communicate them effectively. But the reality is that usually the salesperson is not the individual that understands the system deeply and is the one that actually is able to invent change and think about a new trajectory. And as a result, we end up with a whole bunch of politicians, salespeople, selling products which they don't understand. And you just need to look at, say, the US system where politicians are willing to sign bills when they've never even read the bill. And so they're supporting things they don't even understand. And the last thing I'll mention is that we have a democratic voting system whereby individuals are voting on political parties when they've done zero research and have no understanding about who that political party is. And I was thinking about this yesterday, because we're coming into the election, as I drive down the roads, there's all of the signs in people's lawns. There's all of the vote left, vote right, vote left, vote right. And what they're trying to do is to sway people to vote left or right. Oh, I think the leader for the left party is this. I'm just going to go to the ballot and vote left. But you're voting for something that you have no understanding about. You're not looked into their policies. You don't really understand what their agenda is. And there's not much transparency in that either, and who their affiliated parties are, whether they're part of the World Economic Forum. And so I think that we have a system that you're giving average people the ability to vote for change when they don't have the capacity to go and research what that change actually means. And, there's one more point I'll add, which is any time a new product has ever come into the kind of the world, let's take like Apple. Apple envisioned something that the world needed. And as a result, they brought a product into this world. But if you had voted on that, people likely would have voted no, because they can't envision the future. They can only envision what they have experienced themselves. When BlackBerry had the keypad, the full-length keypad, and Apple brought in the iPhone, which was touch. Initially, if you'd done a poll with people in the world, do you prefer the keypad or do you want touch? The majority of people said, I don't want touch. I want a physical keypad. I like the tactile feel of a keypad. But then the iPhone came out, and within like 2 or 3 years, BlackBerry had basically gone under. And so people are very resistant to change. They can't think about the future. They struggle to think about the future. And so because of that, a voting system that gives power to individuals to think about the future is usually not going to actually create the change necessary, which is needed to actually alter our current course. And so I kind of like jumbled through a couple of those, but I really believe that our current system, the incentives aren't necessarily aligned. There's not much accountability on behalf of the politicians themselves. The politicians themselves many times are just sales individuals. They don't understand the actual problems deeply. And then lastly, you're giving power to individuals that aren't willing to do the research. So they're voting on things they don't understand. And I think that that's where I tend to think the democratic process is flawed in a sense. As for what is better, that's a tough call.
It's a really tough call. And I love the accountability part, because I'm not into, I'm not a long time on this earth. I'm just 26 years old. And I talked with Thomas Strollard actually around that topic, because he had an interesting position. He's like, I have no hope for that system, but I'm still going to vote. The point he was making, he saw it since, what was he saying, 40 or 50 years, something like that. And he always was like, they're doing so bad. There's this new guy, has great ideas. I'm voting for him. And then he came in okay, he turns out to be also an asshole and he does not do anything. Then he votes a new guy in. And this he saw it over all his life for like 40, 50 years, where he always voted a great guy in, and it turned out to be an asshole, just like the previous guy. And I'm already seeing that in my very short life, where I can vote now since like 5, 6, 7 years. I don't know, something like that. Oh no, like actually a little bit earlier. I could have started with 16. I think I started voting with 18. So I can now vote since 10 years. And I've seen that they come in, they praise a lot, and then nothing really happens. I mean, there's always the compromise things, but what really bothers me is the accountability. We have one party that has been in the government since the last 40 years. Sometimes as the leading party, sometimes as the smaller party. In Austria, we have 5 different parties, and they are now saying, oh, like we have to save. And I'm like, who spent the money? Who was in power? They had the finance minister since over 30 years. And now they're saying like, oh, we have to save. And I'm like, yeah, but like who gave the money out? So I get your point about accountability. That really is something. If there's a CFO in a company that just makes minus after minus after minus, he gets thrown out probably after like latest 2 years, probably in the first year if he handles the company right. So yeah, it's a tough topic with accountability. One thing I'm also struggling with is, how much do you keep up with news? How much do you pay attention to what Trump is doing with tariffs and kind of what the system is doing? Maybe also for your jurisdiction, where taxes are going, where bureaucracy is going, and those things. Do you have like a framework where like, okay, once a week I look into things or something like that?
You know what, I'd say it ebbs and flows. And you and I had this conversation just before we jumped on the call, which is this idea of learning and digging into history. And I think that it's so important to read up on history to understand how previous whether it's political parties or whether it's nation states, have approached civilization and society and what their downfall has been. And that gives you much greater insight into the political parties that are running today and the trajectory at which we're on. And I think a lot of these policies sound great on paper. They sound awesome on paper. Hey, I want to protect the environment, so I'm just going to stop all basically energy production. Cool, that's great, except for the fact that we live in a world where we need energy, and GDP and energy are very much intertwined. And so if you cut energy production, you're just going to hugely impact your nation state. And so I think that policies on paper sound great. And again, going back to that point, the average individual doesn't do research. So because they don't do research, they're swayed by what a policy feels as opposed to what a policy is actually going to do. And so I think that doing research is so important, historical research. As for the news, I think that it's a challenging one. I find that with social media today, we're seeing the news from all over the world. We're seeing what's happening in Europe. We're seeing what's happening in freaking Africa. We're seeing what's happening in the US. And it becomes very overwhelming. And I've always been interested in health and psychology. And when we become overwhelmed, and our body goes into some of our stress response systems, fight, flight, freeze, all of a sudden we're flooded with stress hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, adrenaline. These stress hormones hugely impact our nervous system, and our nervous system and immune system are intimately linked. And so when we're stressed repeatedly, it leads to high rates of allergies, again, high rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, all of these things, which is, I would argue, why we're feeling the issues that we're feeling in society today. And so I'm very conscious of the amount of time I spend on social media in the news, because it makes it feel like the world is breaking down. Everything is like freaking, it's hell right now. And there's rioting here, and there's distrust here, and there's so much social tension. And it's really easy to get stuck in these stress response systems. And so I would say that although, yes, I use social media, and predominantly Twitter is pretty much the only thing that I use, I'm very conscious of how much time I spend on it. And I would rather spend time reading up on history, reading up on long form content, because I think that the longer something is taken to create, the more informative it is, or usually the higher probability of it being more informative. And on top of that, like when you read a book, someone may have put their whole life's work into that book. So you can gain such depth of knowledge, whereas a small Twitter post or a news article, there's not much depth there. Someone can just throw it out there. They can even delete it if they were wrong. And so I think that news is oftentimes very misleading and doesn't actually give an accurate representation of what is actually taking place. I think that to get an accurate representation, read history and then have a look at our current trajectory, and that will give you a better representation.
Yeah, we talked about that before, and it's such an interesting topic because I told you before we started, Bitcoin made me excited about history again. I never looked into history, and because of Bitcoin, I looked into the steam engine, printing press, like looked into wars, I looked into revolutions, like what was going on, why was this happening, why was history going in the one direction or in the other direction. How has Bitcoin kind of impacted your approach to learning in general?
Oh man, I think this question doesn't come up enough, and I think that it is profound because I think I mentioned it very briefly earlier, but one of the coolest things about Bitcoin is that they're curious. And so you go down this rabbit hole of Bitcoin and then it starts to open up all of these other avenues, because for me, I was always interested in psychology. I was always interested in sports and kind of human biology. I was always interested in the financial markets. But what I didn't realize is that all of these things are interconnected. And so that's arguably why I wrote The Hidden Cost of Money, is because I realized that when money breaks down, it impacts everything. I very much notice that everything is downstream of money. When our purchasing power starts to degrade, well, all of a sudden parents have to work more. If parents have to work more, well, that impacts their ability to show up for their kids. Same thing, if purchasing power is degrading, people are incentivized to consume over save. So you end up with a very consumption-based economy that is completely impacting our natural environment, because when we consume, we need resources. Resources come out of the forests, the waterways, the ground. So we've got a very destructive society right now as a result of our consumption habits. And the same thing in business and politics. Broken money leads to authoritarianism, totalitarianism. And so I very much believe everything is downstream of money. But it wasn't until I went down Bitcoin that I started to really connect the dots between all of these different areas. And so I think that, like, when it comes to learning, I've just been so blown away by just to what extent money touches every facet of life. And I think it's fascinating, that curiosity. When I went through school, when I was an early teenager, I dropped out of school when I was 14 years old. I hated school. I really did not enjoy school, and I felt that it didn't support curiosity. Instead, it was trying to teach a very structured, regimented approach to how the world works. And it wasn't until I left school that actually I found, I'm not dumb, I'm not thick. I just needed to find things that I'm curious about. And all of a sudden, once I learned how to learn, once I became way more proficient in reading, and I would say one of the biggest things is once I was able to listen to books, it completely changed my life. I remember reading at one point about this kind of listening to books, that our brain, when we read, we sub-vocalize. We say the words on the page in our head and we listen to the words. And this sub-vocalization is 2 steps to actually consuming the content. Whereas listening, you're not having to read. You're basically just listening to the words. It's being consumed. It's only 1 step. So our brain, if we're able to stay focused, is far more efficient at listening than it is reading. And so once I was able to listen to audiobooks, once I was able to convert text to speech, it completely changed my world in terms of my ability to learn.
Yeah, I completely switched to audiobooks. I can read, but I always wander off. Like I cannot. And with audiobook, I just I could be hours on it. I have problems getting away sometimes. It's also, I think, an aspect that often gets overlooked. An aspect that actually made this podcast possible. When I went, and actually Jeff Booth, you talked about it, like he had this realization 99% of his life is still in fiat, and then he switched to Bitcoin, and he said the same thing on my first podcast with him, and I kind of realized, oh shit, like I have a Bitcoin podcast, I am all in Bitcoin, and I'm still working like 40 hours a week on a fiat system. And this and the financial safety that I had from Bitcoin, where I'm like, okay, if it really doesn't go anywhere, I can support myself over a few months maybe on my Bitcoin stack and can live off that and don't have to directly go into, I don't know, my parents' home again or bankruptcy or whatever. I can support myself a few months and see where this road leaves me. And so Bitcoin enabled me to start this podcast. And luckily I never had to take anything out for that. But it also enables anyone to actually take time out and learn again. Because you said the thing that keeps people moving in that rat race, and you really like go about your day and you don't really have a brain for getting anything outside of your work and family in your brain. Bitcoin gives you the time back of like, hey, let's read that book on a Sunday morning. Let's read that book. Maybe 40 hours, because of my Bitcoin stack, like someone saved maybe 10 years now of his life in Bitcoin. Now he's able to, not work 40 hours and go back to 20 hours. And the 20 hours he uses to study and to read books and to listen to books and go about his life or make more time with a family. So I think that's an underrated aspect of Bitcoin, how it can give us time back and give more life into our life with Bitcoin.
Oh man, I couldn't agree more. And one thing that I've actually noticed, and it's a shift that's taking place. Like I ended up going a little too heavy into the listening to books, and I started setting goals, and I actually moved away from that. I started setting goals as like, okay, you know what? I think it was maybe 2020, I was like, I want to read 52 books in a year, one book a week. And so I went down that rabbit hole. And then I was like, you know what? I want to read 100 books in a year. So then I read 100 books in a year. And I think I got up to like in 1 year, I think I ended up reading like 134 books or something. And I was just like, what am I doing? Like, I am consuming all this information, but am I really contemplating the information? Am I integrating that information? And is it kind of, am I storing it alongside this information, or am I just kind of consuming information for the sake of consuming information? And so I've noticed in the last 3 or 4 years that my information consumption has slowed down, and I'm now on probably like 15 to 25 books a year. But what I'm noticing is that I'm spending way more time with the books, and I'm also thinking about them a lot more, because I think it's one thing for consuming information for information's sake. It's another thing to consume information and integrate it and think, how does this fit in to my current view on the world? And maybe these other books that I've read. And so I think that it's really important to contemplate the information we're consuming and not just consume for the sake of consumption. And I think that the other point that I'll make on that is that for me, what has made such a huge difference in my consumption and integration of knowledge is note-taking. And so I use an app called Obsidian. It's kind of a free open source software. And it is absolutely profound. And it's this idea that humans, we have a phenomenal ability to connect the dots between two abstract ideas and be like, I'm interested in this and I'm interested in this. I wonder if I can create a product that combines this and this, and you create a new product. We're amazing at these abstract creative ideas. What humans aren't that good at is thinking and storing specific information and details, remembering numbers, remembering dates of things, exactly when things happened. And this is why, like in a court of law with eyewitness testimony after 7 years, it's like invalid, because our mind is constantly changing. Our ability to remember things is shifting. And so we're not that good at remembering specific facts. We're really good at piecing together dots. And so when I started note-taking, all of a sudden it allowed me to unload all of the specific information and to really just think about the narrative, the overarching narrative of these books. And so piece together my worldview more easily. And when it came to actually using that information, such as writing a book, all of a sudden I had 500 plus books that I had notes on, and I was able to cite all of them word for word on these specific paragraphs or things that stood out to me. And that profoundly changed my life, taking notes on things. And the final point on note taking that really kind of made a huge difference is that many times I think we're taught from school to take notes on like, okay, when reading this book, chapter 1, this is what chapter 1 is about. Chapter 2, this is what chapter 2 is about. These are the important points. That's such a poor way of taking notes. The reality is that if you want notes to work effectively, what you have to do is you have to take notes on things that interest you and stand out to you. So what I'll do is, as I'm reading through a book, I'll be like, oh my God, that is fascinating. I'll take that and I'll take note of it. And then by the time I finish the book, what I'll do is I'll read through all of those notes that I've taken, and I will first bold all the ones that were like, that's meaningful, that is huge. And then what I'll do is go through a second round, and all the ones that were bold, if I found not only is that meaningful, that is profound, I've never thought about this in that way, I will then expand on it in my own words. And so in doing so, this 3-step process of first taking notes on things that interest you from the book, secondly, bolding the ones that stand out, and third, expanding on the ones that are profound. What that does is it integrates this knowledge into your current understanding, and by putting it into your own words, you're deepening your understanding of these things. And so I found taking notes on books and then approaching it from this method profoundly improved my understanding of the world and piecing together this puzzle of how I think the world works.
Love that. There's so many people say take notes, but I never took notes because I was like, oh, like what should I do if there's notes? I'm just writing down what I think because I don't know. I don't go after like 2 years back in the notes. And if I do, I probably don't even know why I took this note and stuff like that. But with that, you immediately get it in you because you thought about why it was profound for you and you write it out in your own words. That's what I currently do with Bitcoin related content. But when I read outside of Bitcoin, I actually don't do that. I only do it with Bitcoin things actually, because with Bitcoin things, I have like I have lists and places where things go. So if I found something very interesting, no matter if I read in a book, if I hear it from a podcast, I literally just write down like he said that at that podcast at that minute. And what it is. So later I can go back and see it actually. And it's kind of a to-do list of things I can look through to get inspiration for articles, tweets, or the book that I might write. So there's a lot of things in that, but taking notes in this 3-step process of what is interesting, then trying to figure out, okay, what is profound about that? And then the third step is basically writing in your own words why and extending on that idea is really, I think the last step actually is for me the most important one, because then you really think about it before you, okay, that is interesting. I get it out. Like, oh, that's really interesting. I make it bold. But then extending on that's brilliant. I never heard that.
Well, and
thank you so much.
For me as well, there's something else which is really important, which is when we take notes in isolation. I used to take notes just through the Apple Note app. Anytime I read a book, I take notes. The problem with that is each note stacks on top of one another. So 3 years later, you're just like, oh man, I read that book, but I can't remember that book. What was it? Frig, I can't remember it. And it's gone. You've lost that information. You're probably never going to find it again. And so it's also important to be able to retrieve that information easily. And so what I try to do is I structure my notes in a way that allows me to locate notes in the future. And it's also really, not only is it important to structure your notes and have tags like, okay, this book is about these subjects. So that's really easy for me to be like, there was that book about psychology that touched on these subjects. And then I can go and search up psychology in my notes and I can go and find that book. But when I'm actually going through reading a book and taking notes on that book, if something sparks like, this paragraph in this book reminds me of this book, and this book was really profound, connect those two dots in the note. And what you're doing is you're actually effectively, you're mimicking the brain. You're creating neural pathways between pieces of information. And so you're basically saying, this book has taught me about this, but it reminds me of this book where it also expands on it here. And so I link those two notes. And I can show very briefly, I don't know if I'm able to share here.
You should be able to share if the browser has the permission to share.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can share here. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes, I see it.
So can you see my note taking out? So this mimics the brain. Every single one of these little dots, and for those that are listening, as opposed to viewing this, there's basically a whole bunch of dots that look like little synapses on a brain. And then when you hover over, the bigger the dot, the more connection points it's got. And so, for instance, I can hover over this one, and it says spirituality. It shows all of the notes that I have taken, that I've tagged with spirituality. And so each of those points represents something that I believe ties back to spirituality. But again, it's really important to be able to actually locate notes. And so for me, you have an index page. I can click on various interest types, content types, and I can go down to, say, books, and I can go to my 5-star rated books. And then I can go into like any of these books, Atomic Habits by James Clear, Becoming the One by Shay Liana. Let's click on Atomic Habits. And then you see all of the notes and breaking these down, and you can see the ones that I've bolded. And in this one, I don't have any links to other things, but it's just having a structured note-taking app or approach profoundly changes your ability to create content and to distill content that you've learned about.
That is, wow, I love that. It looks like a world map, honestly. It looks like your own mind world of all your thoughts and all your ideas.
Oh man, to me, it's completely changed my life, because I know that there's a couple individuals that refer to it by this, but it's kind of like my second brain. I have my internal brain, which is obviously storing all of my creative ideas and my rough idea or structure of how I think the world works. And then there's my second brain, which has got all of the details from all of the books that I've read throughout my life that I've taken notes on that I can reference at any time. And it's easy for me to pull that information from. And so those two brains in concert with one another massively amplify my ability to show up in this world, to create content, to write books. And that's the only reason why at the end of The Hidden Cost of Money, my book, I think there's something like 500 citations. And the only reason why I have that is because by the time I actually went to go write the book, I had 10 years of notes that I was able to pull from and be like, this paragraph and this point and this thing, I was able to pull from them and cite them. And so it profoundly changed my life once I started taking notes.
So you're listening to audiobooks, and are you sitting down, or you're walking around? Like, how do you usually listen to books?
So this is probably the most profound. If I was to say, if there was one app that has changed my life, there's an app called Voice Dream Reader. And I've friggin' shared this app a million times. I just think it's incredible. Voice Dream Reader, I think it's now, it's like a subscription thing. It used to be like a one-off payment. But anyway, what Voice Dream Reader does is you can put any ebook, whether it's an EPUB, whether it's a PDF, you can share web pages into it, you can share text documents, anything that has got text, and then it will read that text to you. You can select the voice. And now I think in the newest versions, it's actually got AI voices. So it's way better. It's not as robotic. And it will read it to you. But what's interesting is the screen, it will highlight where you are in the text as it's reading it to you. So I can go and walk through the forest and listen. And at the same time, if it says something that I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing, I want to quote that, because it's following along with the text, I can copy and paste the text into my note, and I have the exact quote word for word in text, as well as listening to it. And so Voice Dream Reader, I've probably been using for about 7-8 years now. And Voice Dream Reader, if there's one app that I recommend, profoundly changed my life, like profoundly.
Wow, I love that. So you buy or get the ebook from the internet, and then you put it in there. I heard about Speechify. I think that's a app that also does a similar thing.
Yeah, they do similar things as well. And I think this is Speechify. It's good. I find that Voice Dream Reader is more specific to content consumption and long form content. Like I can put in any ebook, any PDF straight in there, and you can just follow along and read the ebook as if you normally would, or you can go for a walk. And so I find I have a dog, I have a husky. I probably spend a few hours a day, every day, walking through the forest. And I also find that moving, getting blood flow while you're listening, while you're learning, amplifies the ability to absorb knowledge. If I'm sat sedentary and my blood is not flowing, my heart isn't beating to the same extent, I find it a lot harder to consume knowledge. So once I start walking in the forest, in a grounding area, I can't just go walk in the city. If I'm walking in the forest in a grounded area, I'm not having to interact, I find that's the best place to absorb knowledge.
Do you do this multiple times a day, or like one really long 3-hour walk?
I usually walk in the morning with the dog, midday with the dog, and in the evening with the dog. And then, like, to your point, I also listen to books if I'm driving. Like, I live about an hour and a half from Vancouver. And so to drive down to Vancouver on the highway, I just chuck a book on and I'm listening to a book. And I find that the average individual they usually say, I don't have time to learn. I don't have time to research. I don't have time to do these things. And then you realize, actually, cool, you've got like 30, 40 minutes while you're making dinner. Maybe you spend an hour and a half in the car each day driving. Maybe you have a dog and you're walking the dog. Like all of those periods you could be using to consume knowledge. And that's where I've found like over the years, all of us have 3 to 5 hours in a day that we are doing something, but we're not cognitively we're not being like demanded cognitively that we could use to listen to something.
I actually started planning walks now because I had walks when I lived at my parents' house years ago, because we also had a dog and I was forced to walk the dog. And then after a while, I actually enjoyed it. And now moving into the city, I don't have that anymore, but we have a really big palace and where there's like a really huge forest around it. So I usually go there and I force myself to walk around 10 kilometers, which is 6 miles, something like that, per day in the morning. I don't do it multiple times a day. It would be probably best like do in the morning and a little bit in the evening, but I just want to get it out of the way in the morning directly. And it's such an amazing time. I listen to whatever I want to listen, but mostly audiobooks, like Muslim audiobooks, but I never take notes on that. I think you should start that. I think you changed the way I listen to books, I think.
That's awesome. No, well, yeah, I just really appreciate curious individuals that are interested about the world. And so I appreciate you sharing that.
Really cool. Speaking on what you have learned and stuff like that, it's really great. I have one question that I asked each and every one of my guests, and for repeating guests, I changed it a little bit. And the question is, what have you learned since you have last been on the podcast? It's been around, I think, a year or something like that, which isn't about Bitcoin.
Oh, this is so good. Okay, you know what? The most recent rabbit hole that I have gone down deeply is how, maybe this is a little personal, but for the last like 5-6 years, I've had like eczema here. Underneath the eyes, I've had this eczema flare up. And I was like, is this dietary related? And I'm eating freaking like grass-fed beef. I'm eating like organic vegetables, of which vegetables I do eat. I don't eat a ton of them. I eat like raw milk that is like from a grass-fed farm. I'm just like, what is going on? Like, what is flaring this? So I was like, well, maybe I've become allergic to freaking milk. So I cut milk. And then I went and saw a naturopath and they're like, maybe you should cut eggs as well, because eggs can be hard. I'm just like, okay, so I cut eggs. I'm just like, cool, I'm eating freaking sweet potatoes and meat. I'm just like, I love it. It's a little bland. It's a little boring after a while. So I noticed that sometimes it would flare up with things and other times it wouldn't. And I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't seem like an allergy. If we're allergic to something, it is consistent. If you have that allergen, it will trigger an immune response. So I was like, this doesn't seem like an allergy. I don't know what it is. So then I went down, and I've went down this rabbit hole years ago, and I never really kind of followed through. I went down the parasite rabbit hole, and it's a deep rabbit hole to go down because you realize that all of us have parasites. Every single one of us have parasites, and some parasites are good. Most parasites are bad. And those parasites are consuming a lot of our nutrients. They're emitting toxins, which leads to a whole bunch of our health issues, neurological issues, allergies, you name it, autoimmune issues. And there's studies coming out now that are profound. Like in 100% of multiple sclerosis patients, they have parasites in their spinal fluid, in 100% of multiple sclerosis patients. And there's a lot of cancer patients that they're now tying that there's a lot of studies that are showing that cancer is a result of parasites. And it's profound when you go down this rabbit hole. And so I am been reading up for the last maybe like month and a half, 2 months on the most effective parasite cleanse. And one of my good friends ended up going and doing a parasite cleanse recently. And she was just like, oh, I don't really expect much of it. She's like pretty healthy. She lives in the mountains, eats good quality food, very conscious of her health. She did a parasite cleanse. And what came out the other end, I'm not going to share, was just like absolutely disgusting. Like, absolutely disgusting. And so right now I'm just like, you know what? I want to get rid of whatever is inside of me. And so I'm going down this rabbit hole of parasite cleanse. And so hopefully, maybe the next time we'll talk, I'm hopefully going to do a parasite cleanse over the next like 2.5 months. And we'll see what the results are and see if that resolves some of these health issues that have been going on for years that I've not been able to figure out. And they just seem like the health practitioners can't figure out. And a lot of health practitioners are also they're just like, oh, parasites aren't an issue. Like parasite tests don't come up positive for parasites, but then you actually do these parasite cleanses and everyone has parasites. So that is a bit of a random topic, but that's what I'm going through right now.
I never heard about that. Like literally never heard about that. I have to check it out later to see parasites. Really cool. We have an end routine, as you know, from the previous episode that we had, where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest is. And the previous guest asked you the question, what is the biggest lie that you have been living that Bitcoin revealed to you?
I think the biggest lie that Bitcoin is increasingly revealing to me is that I believe we are in a simulation. And I had a really good conversation with Preston Pish when we were just recently at a conference together, and we were talking, and he shared the most profound explanation of, and I'm not saying this is his belief, he just shared this explanation of whether or not we're in a simulation. And the explanation that he gave is, let's just say we're in a society, and we're in a very primitive society, and we start to become more productive, and we start to become more efficient, and we start to create tools. And eventually those tools start to take our jobs, and those tools start to impede our ability to show up and contribute to society. And eventually we create AI, and AI and robotics basically make humans redundant. Well, what would we do under that situation if we're getting rising rates of depression and anxiety and suicide and drug use because basically we've just got no hope? We don't have any ability to feel like we're contributing to society. What would we do? Well, we'd probably create a simulation, and we'd step into that simulation back to a more primitive time. So now we're in a simulation in a primitive time. And what do? We start to increase our productivity, efficiency, and we create tools, and we create it again. And so one of the things he says is, I wonder if AI was created or if AI was discovered. Discovered as in we discovered it again. It's been created in the past, and we're just rediscovering it as we're stepping into these simulations time and time and time and time again. And to me, as I go down these rabbit holes, there's a lot more to it than just that conversation. But there's a lot more that, to me, I just feel like there's a big facade as to how we think the world works. And I think the world doesn't work in that way. I think that Bitcoin is kind of lifting the curtain, and you're realizing, the monetary system doesn't work in the way that I thought it works. The healthcare system doesn't work in the way that I thought it works. Education, I feel like we're being spun a lot of propaganda and a lot of lies. And so I think that, to me, I'm starting to increasingly lean into this idea that I think we are in a simulation of sorts. And I find that a really interesting thing. I don't find it scary. I find it really interesting. But that's probably the biggest lie that I've come across so far.
It's like when Neo discovered that there are multiple versions of the Matrix. What was it, the first movie or the second? Probably I don't know. It's been so long that I've watched the movies, but where Neo stepped in and he discovered that this is not the first Matrix and he's not the first Neo basically in the system. And it's like a loop that is going on. That is profound. I also love the thing that Elon Musk gave as an explanation of why we could be in a matrix or in a simulation. He said, like, the video games 20 years from now or 10 years from now was so much more like obvious that it's a video game than it's now. If you now play, let's take FIFA, like the football simulator, if you look outside from the window of a bar into a TV, you have no way of knowing if it's a football simulator or actually a television of showing an actual football game. Mm-hmm. If you spend that further and further out, and video games get much better, and simulations of sorts get much better, you have no way of knowing if things are actually real or if it's basically just like a simulation or a video game. So the likelihood that we are in a simulation is non-zero. And this thing of that it's non-zero, whatever the percentage likelihood of that is really mind-boggling for me. I'm like, like maybe all those things are pre-programmed, and how much can I actually decide for myself, even in that simulation. Like maybe it was always meant to be that I have to do the Bitcoin podcast like that. Maybe that was pre-programmed that I go there to go through the steps. So yeah, that's a really deep rabbit hole.
What I think is interesting is if we are indeed stepping into this simulation and then into the next simulation and into the next simulation, could Bitcoin be a way to break that chain? In that, at the moment, what is causing us to slowly, increasingly find a lack of purpose in life and meaninglessness? And yes, we do have technology advancing, and that's not going to stop. But I think the money plays a huge role in that people are struggling to survive with basically just existing. And so people are trying to escape life. And when it comes to Bitcoin, what if Bitcoin enabled people, because of the increasing purchasing power, it enabled people more capacity to show up wholeheartedly in life, to contribute time to their communities, to contribute time to their families, and to find value in different, more traditional ways. And so it maybe reverses this course of stepping into these simulations. And that, I think, is profound.
Seb, it has been one of my favorite conversations so far. It was really, really cool to step into with you in so many different conversations. I should share that once on my podcast. I usually have there's a feature on Riverside where you can take notes of where you find the conversation very interesting to put that into intro and the clips and stuff like that. So you can already do it. And there are two types of conversations. One where there's almost none there because there was not that much interesting things in there. And then there are those conversations where there's so much in there. There's 10, 20 markers in there where it's almost too much. And today I completely forgot about that. I completely forgot. It was so interesting that I completely forgot to even take those marks. So we'll make the post-production harder for the editor. So sorry, Pablo. But it happened. So thank you so much for having that great conversation with us today. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions and reach out to you?
Oh man. And Robin, I really appreciate you having me on. I think that, as I mentioned at the start, you have such a way with words and you ask such phenomenal questions. And I really just appreciate the curiosity. And so, yeah, I really enjoy these conversations and I'm looking forward to the third one, whenever that is. I'm curious to see what it is that has changed. What is the next biggest lie in our lives? But, yeah, people can find me on Twitter just at Seb Bunney, and Bunney is Bunney. I do have a little blog. I don't post on it too often because I try to post when something inspires me as opposed to trying to be frequent and just posting for the sake of posting. And then on top of that, we discussed quite a bit of my book, The Hidden Cost of Money. And so if people are curious about how money weaves its influence into the world around us, you can find The Hidden Cost of Money on Amazon and a lot of other sites. And then the final thing I'll say is I never want education or price to be a barrier to education. And so if someone can't afford the book, feel free to just reach out on Twitter and I'm more than happy to give you the ebook for free. I just want to be able to make education available to everyone. And again, I really appreciate you having me on, Robin.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it a lot. Also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.